Hitler, Hamas, and Jihadist Jew Hatred by David Patterson. Quote, after the war, Lawrence Wright comments, quote, Cairo became a sanctuary for Nazis who advised the military and the government. The rise of the Islamist movement coincided with the decline of fascism, but they overlapped in Egypt, and the germ passed into a new carrier, end quote. Lawrence Wright, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11. The germ of National Socialism, however, passed into the Arab-Muslim world long before the end of the Second World War. One of the first of the modern jihadist ideologues, Indian-born Abdul al-Maududi, welcomed the rise of National Socialism and venerated the new movement. See Sayyid Abdullah Maudi, The Process of Islamic Revolution. Similarly, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in March 1928, from which Hamas was born on the 29th of December 1987, expressed his admiration for Hitler, and his ideological successor, Sayyid Qutb, names not only al-Banna but also Maududi among his primary influences. In the 1930s, the Nazi influence was manifest throughout Muslim culture. Haj Amin al-Husseini's collaboration with the Nazis throughout the reign of the Third Reich is well known and well documented. Matthias Kunzel points out that the Mufti's Arab Revolt of 1936, quote, took place against the background of the swastika. Arab leaflets and signs on walls were prominently marked with this Nazi symbol. The youth organization of al-Husseini's political party paraded as, quote, Nazi scouts, and Arab children greeted each other with the Nazi salute, end quote. Other Nazi influences on Muslim culture can be seen, for example, in a musical refrain that ran throughout the Arab world at the time. Quote, no more Monsieur, no more Mr., in heaven Allah, on earth Hitler, end quote. Nor did the adulation of the Führer abate after his defeat. In 1953, when there were rumors of Hitler's being alive, Anwar Sadat wrote a tribute to him, quote, my dear Hitler, I congratulate you from the bottom of my heart. Even if you appear to have been defeated, in reality you are the victor, end quote. If you don't know who Anwar Sadat is, Anwar Sadat was the prime minister or head, or I'm not exactly sure of his title, but the leader of Egypt after Nasser. Let me read his Muhammad Anwar Sadat was an Egyptian politician and military officer who served as the third president of Egypt from 15th of October 1970 until his assassination by fundamentalist army officers on the 6th of October 1981. Sadat was a senior member of the Free Officers who overthrew King Farouk in the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 and close confidant of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, under whom he served as vice president twice and whom he succeeded as president in 1970. In 1970, Sadat and Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, signed a peace treaty in cooperation with United States President Jimmy Carter, for which they were recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. In his 11 years as president, Sadat changed Egypt's trajectory, departing from many of the political and economic tenets of Nasserism, reinstituting a multi-party system and launching the In FETA economic policy. As president, he led Egypt in the Yom Kippur War of 1973 to regain Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had occupied since the Six-Day War of 1967, making him a hero in Egypt and for a long time the wider Arab world. Afterwards, he engaged in negotiations with Israel, culminating in the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. This won him and Menahem Begin the Nobel Peace Prize, making Sadat the first Muslim Nobel laureate. Although reaction to the treaty, which resulted in the return of Sinai to Egypt, was generally favorable among Egyptians, it was rejected by the country's Muslim Brotherhood and the left, which felt Sadat had abandoned efforts to ensure a Palestinian state. With the exception of Sudan, the Arab world and the Palestinian Liberation Organization strongly opposed Sadat's efforts to make a separate peace with Israel without prior consultations with the Arab states. His refusal to reconcile with them over the Palestinian issue resulted in Egypt being suspended from the Arab League from 1979 to 1989. The peace treaty was also one of the primary factors that led to his assassination on the 6th of October 1981. Militants led by Khalid Islambouli opened fire on Sadat with automatic rifles during the 6th of October parade in Cairo, killing him. Sorry, I guess I didn't really need to read all that, but I felt insecure about my knowledge. Anyway, back to the text. In 1953, when there were rumors of Hitler's being alive, Anwar Sadat wrote a tribute to him, quote, "My dear Hitler, I congratulate you from the bottom of my heart. Even if you appear to have been defeated, in reality you are the victor," end quote. And in an article in the July 19th, 1982 edition of the Egyptian newspaper Al-Ahrar, Dr. Yahya al-Rakhawi asserts, quote, "The great man Hitler, may God have mercy on him, who was the wisest of those who confronted the Jewish problem, and out of compassion for humanity tried to exterminate every Jew," end quote. With regard to the Nazi influence on Hamas, Itamar Marcus and Barbara Crook observe that, quote, "Hamas's justification for the extermination of Jews, both as God's will and for the benefit of humanity, echoes Hitler's words in Mein Kampf, quote, if the Jew, with the help of his Marxist creed, is victorious over the peoples of this world, then his crown will be the funeral wreath of humanity. Thus I believe today that I am acting according to the will of the Almighty Creator. When I defend myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord," end quote. Hitler, Mein Kampf. Hitler's influence derived above all from his anti-Semitic ideology, particularly as it was expressed in Mein Kampf. The first Arabic edition of the manifesto appeared in Egypt in 1939. The edition most widely distributed in the Muslim world today, however, was first published in 1963. In the introduction to his translation, Louis Al-Hajj proclaims his adoration of, quote, Hitler's jihad as a soldier, end quote, and his, quote, jihad for truth. It should be noted that the Arabic edition of Mein Kampf is not a complete translation of Hitler's work. Rather, it consists of selections grouped into 5 thematic categories: Hitler and the Jews, Hitler and his followers, Hitler and race, Hitler and Nazism, and Hitler's spiritual movement. It should also be noted that Hamas is a particular instance of a widespread phenomenon referred to here as, quote, Islamic Jihadism, so that in what follows, whatever is said of the Nazi influence on Islamic Jihadism also applies to its influence on the worldview of Hamas. One, Nazi race theory and Jew hatred. In Nazi ideology, the notion of race is rooted not in color or physiognomy, but in a concept of human essence. It is a category under which body and soul are fused into one. National Socialism, says Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg, quote, departs from the single but completely decisive avowal, namely from the avowal that blood and character, race and soul are merely designations for the same entity, end quote. The Jew, therefore, is an essential threat to the Aryan essence, which makes the Jew a pathological threat. Similarly, Said Qutb maintained that, quote, Jews as Jews were by nature determined to fight Allah's truth, and sow corruption and confusion, end quote. And that, quote, the deeper cause of Jewish hatred of Islam was the malevolent Jewish nature, end quote. From the standpoint of Islamic Jihadism, Jews are not accorded the same possibility of conversion that is open to the rest of humanity. In the worldview of Hamas, then, the Jew is refused any status as dhimmi, that is, as people who, as long as they accept their servitude, enjoy the, quote, protection of the law. Just as in Nazi Europe the Jews were afforded no protection under the law, so the Jews are situated outside the protection of Islamic law in its jihadist mode. On the contrary, Islamic jihadist ideology demands not the protection but the extermination of the Jew out of a sense of piety. The Muslims' call to kill the Jews dates back to the Jerusalem riots of April 4th to 5th, 1920, when posters in the Muslim quarter read, quote, kill the Jews, there is no punishment for killing Jews, end quote. Prior to the Arab riots against the Jews in August 1929, al-Husseini and his fellow Muslim preachers declared that, quote, he who kills a Jew is assured a place in the next world, end quote. He repeated the exhortation to, quote, kill Jews wherever you find them, end quote, in a speech from Berlin on May 4th, 1944, to Muslim Ansar SS killing units, insisting that it pleases Allah. If it pleases Allah, then for Hamas, killing Jews is not about, quote, freeing Palestine or, quote, driving out a, quote, oppressor or even revenge. It is about serving God. And that makes it an absolute duty, just as a Nazi cannot be a true Nazi without murdering Jews, so the adherent of Hamas cannot be a true Muslim without murdering Jews. The jihadist ticket into paradise is a dead Jew. Thus Hamas surpasses the Nazis by making the murder of Jews not only an ontological necessity, but also a religious duty. Two, Mein Kampf and its ideological influence. A, the struggle for the soul of the child. The most infamous statement of Nazi ideology is Hitler's Mein Kampf. One of the most terrifying of his assertions comes early on, where he declares that the Nazi struggle is, quote, a struggle for the soul of the child, end quote. Hamas shares Hitler's views on the struggle for the soul of the child. Poisoning children with a deep-rooted Jew hatred and thus appropriating their souls in the service of the ideology is a crucial part of Nazi and jihadist strategy. One need only take note of children's television programming in Gaza to get this point. Thus the jihadists have taken Hitler's assertion in Mein Kampf to heart, quote, only the greatness of the sacrifices will win new fighters for the cause, end quote. What sacrifice is greater than child sacrifice made at the hands of the mothers who brought them into the world? If the Nazis captured the souls of their children, the jihadists destroy them by training them not just for sacrifice, but for murder. Like the ancient idolaters against whom God warned the Israelites, see, for instance, Deuteronomy 18:10, They pass their children through fire and worse, making their children into sacrificial offerings consumed by the flames of their bombs. They transform them into murderers. In this difference between not the Nazis and the jihadists, we have another glimpse of the jihadist evil in general and the evil of Hamas in particular. In its charter, which they deem the, quote, Charter of Allah, Article 18 declares that the Muslim who takes her, quote, religion seriously is the mother who lays her child on the sacrificial altar of homicide. B. Violence as means and end. Other pronouncements in Mein Kampf have their echoes in Islamic jihadism in general and in the worldview of Hamas in particular. Like the spread of jihadism, for instance, the spread of National Socialism can be accompanied only through force. Thus says the Führer, the, quote, complete annihilation of a doctrine, quote, can be carried out only through a process of extermination, ... Only in the steady and constant application of force lies the very first prerequisite for success, end quote. Hassan al-Banna understood this principle of murderous violence from Mein Kampf only too well. He described the use of force as, quote, the motto of Islam, end quote, force, quote, of doctrine, and force, quote, of arms. The, quote, doctrine Hitler had in mind, of course, is Judaism, which is as undermining to Hamas as it is to National Socialism. When it comes to the Jews, only complete annihilation will do, as suggested in Article 17 of the Hamas Charter. And Article 15 repeats the refrain, quote, I will assault and kill, assault and kill, assault and kill, end quote, the Jews. Hitler goes on to assert, quote, the fight against a spiritual power with methods of violence remains defensive. However, until the sword becomes the support, the herald and disseminator of new spiritual doctrine, end quote. It is not for nothing that the embers of the Muslim Brotherhood and its offspring Hamas display weapons. C. Propaganda inciting hatred through lies. Early on, al-Banna indicated that he learned a great deal from the Nazis about the importance of propaganda. In 1935, Hassan al-Banna organized the Muslim Brotherhood's first propaganda committee, and in 1943, the Muslim Brotherhood published its first edition of our propaganda aims. Both for the Nazis and for the Islamic Jihadists, the aim of propaganda is not merely to convince a population to adopt a certain ideological viewpoint, as if propaganda were some sort of ad campaign or mere matter of public relations. No, in Hitler's words, the aim of propaganda is to, quote, re-implant the spirit of proud self-reliance, manly defiance, and wrathful hatred, end quote. Yes, hatred. One must hate the Jew targeted for extermination. Any means can be justified to attain the ideological end, including and above all falsehood and deception. Just so Hitler understood deception to be an important part of the strategy of any propaganda campaign since, quote, something of the most insolent lie will always remain and stick, end quote. That is how you breed, quote, wrathful hatred. The Nazis were masters of the, quote, most insolent lie, accusing the Jews of everything from age-old blood libel to secretly plotting to take over the world. Both Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, from which it stems, echo the Nazis', quote, most insolent, end quote, lies and even take them further. Bernard Lewis notes several examples of the fantastic lies spread by Muslim Brotherhood propaganda, where the Jews, quote, are accused of infecting girls with AIDS and syphilis and sending them to Egypt to spread these diseases. They are also accused of supplying Egyptian women with hyper-aphrodisiac chewing gum, which drives them into a frenzy of sexual desire, end quote, as well as, quote, of deliberately spreading cancer among the Egyptians and other Arabs by devising and disseminating carcinogenic cucumbers and shampoos, of promoting drug-taking and devil worship and organizing a campaign to legalize homosexuality, end quote. Bernard Lewis. In other words, Jews are behind every evil that might threaten a society. They must be hated, and hated wrathfully. Borrowing from the Nazis' images of the Jews, cartoons and newspapers throughout the Muslim world depict Jews as, quote, dirty, hook-nosed, money-grabbing, vindictive, scheming, and cruel, end quote. Such images underscore Hitler's statement that, quote, no one need be surprised if among our people the personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew, end quote. That is the, quote, most insolent lie, end quote, that permeates Nazi and jihadist propaganda. The Jew is the incarnation and source of all evil, and the point of the emanation of that evil into the world has a name. It is the, quote, Zionist entity. The attack on Zionists and Zionism did not begin with Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and other infamous jihadist movements. It was part of the discourse of National Socialist ideology from the early days of the Nazi Party. In 1921, Alfred Rosenberg published Zionism, Enemy of the State, in which he argued that Zionism is a Jewish strategy for world domination. Even prior to the formation of the Nazi Party in 1920, says Hitler, he discovered during his years in Vienna, 1907 to 1913, the, quote, national character of the Jews, that is, their true evil, quote, in the Zionists. As though writing the script of Islamic Jihadist, he asserts, while the Nazis tried to make the rest of the world, while the Zionists tried to make the rest of the world believe that the national consciousness of the Jew finds its satisfaction in the creation of a Palestinian state, the Jews again slyly dupe the dumb Goyim. It doesn't even enter their heads to build up a Jewish state in Palestine for the purpose of living there. All they want is a central organization for their international world swindle, end quote. Adolf Hitler. Therefore, quote, the Jewish state, according to the Fuhrer, quote, is completely unlimited as to territory, end quote, and the measures taken to oppose the Jewish state must be equally unlimited. It is important to note that by the term Zionism, the Jews and the jihadists referred to quite different things. For the Jews, Zionism is the movement to create and sustain not just a Jewish state, but a haven for the Jewish people in a world that remains hostile to them. Thus understood, anyone who opposes Zionism must believe that another Holocaust is either impossible or desirable. Those who believe it is impossible need only recall the fact that on September 23rd, 2008, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was given a podium at the United Nations. Ahmadinejad was like the head, like the leader, not the leader proper. Well, I don't know what exactly his political status is. Let's just say he was the leader of Iran in the early 2000s, and you recognize his face if you don't know who he is. From the place of distinction, he spewed forth a diatribe against the Jews that the Fuhrer himself could have delivered from the balconies of Berlin. It's also important to note that a lot of leftist groups met with Ahmadinejad. He came to America, and including the group Code Pink was at a meeting with Ahmadinejad. To my understanding, maybe I'm just spreading conspiracy theories and lies, but I think that is definitely, in fact, the case. And with admirable exception of the United States, the nations of the world ... applauded. As for the Nazis and Hamas, the term Zionism refers to the creation of neither a homeland nor a haven, but base of operations from which the Jews may carry out their plan for world conquest. A familiar image employed by Nazi propagandists to illustrate the Zionist threat shows an octopus with its tentacles wrapped around the entire globe and a Star of David inscribed on its head. The same image can be found among many of the jihadist illustrations of nefarious, quote, world Zionism. Picking up on this theme, Article 32 of the Hamas Charter states, quote, after Palestine, the Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates, end quote. End quote. Their plan is embodied in the, quote, protocols of the elders of Zion, end quote. End quote. The Islamic resistance movement considers itself to be the spearhead of the struggle with world Zionism, end quote. Once again, what is actually a jihadist struggle to control the world is cast in terms of saving the world. It's always important to remember that the Nazis had the attitude that they were doing not just Germany, but the world a favor in their extermination process. And they frequently said that the Jews were trying to initiate a genocide against the German people, projecting their murderous desires onto others. In such statements from Hamas, one finds echoes of another important aspect of Nazi ideology, the conviction that humanity is threatened by a takeover on the part of secret international organization of world Jewry, and that only the Nazis or the jihadists can save humanity. The Jew, says Hitler, is an, quote, invisible wire puller, end quote. Similarly, Article 22 of the Hamas Charter states that the Jews are the founders of secret societies such as Freemasons, Rotary Clubs, Lions, and others. Quote, they were behind World War I, end quote. They, quote, formed the League of Nations through which they could rule the world, end quote. And they replaced the League of Nations with the United Nations, quote, through which they could rule the world, end quote. Only a holy war, only jihad can oppose such evil. Since the Jew is seen as being evil in his essence, he cannot be human. The Jew is, quote, an ape, says Hitler, echoing the teaching from the Quran. Commenting on the Quran's statement that Allah changed Jews into pigs and apes, the Hamas monthly magazine, Palestine al-Muslima, states, quote, the transformation was actual, end quote. If the Jews are, quote, falsifiers of divine truth, end quote, as Sayyid Qutb declares, then for those who love the truth, Jew hatred is a mark of righteousness. There can be no compromise. Thus it is written in Article 13 of the Hamas Charter, quote, peace initiatives, the so-called peaceful solutions and the international conferences to resolve the Palestinian problem are all contrary to the beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement, end quote. For a follower of Hamas to enter into any serious negotiation for peace with the Jews would amount to renouncing Allah and Islam. Concluding remarks. Inasmuch as Hamas's reform of Islam has been influenced by National Socialist ideology, its worldview is not a throwback to a medieval mindset. However, by establishing a scriptural foundation for their actions, Hamas may justify, indeed may demand, any action. By eclipsing God, the Nazis eclipsed the absolute obligation imposed from beyond, so that the inner will posed the only limits to their actions. By appropriating God, Hamas has appropriated the authority to impose what they have determined to be the transcendent will of Allah. If the charter of Hamas is the, quote, charter of Allah, then Hamas is Allah, which means that what Hamas would represent as a service of God is in fact a usurpation of God. Like the Nazis, when they would get rid of God, like the Nazis, then they would get rid of God. How? By first demonizing and then exterminating the chosen of God, the Jewish people.